I wasn't looking for alchemical secrets when I started cataloguing the spires. I was documenting architectural degradation patterns in 19th century buildings across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Standard preservation work, the kind of thing you measure, photograph, file in reports, and move on from. But then I noticed something that made no sense. The copper domes and spires on certain buildings, structures supposedly built in the 1700s and 1800s, weren't oxidizing the way copper should. They weren't turning green, they were turning red. Not rust red, not the brownish patina of aged copper exposed to normal atmospheric conditions. Deep crimson red, blood red, a color that shouldn't exist on copper architecture, yet appears with disturbing frequency on specific types of buildings across a geographical band stretching from St. Malo, Petersburg through Central Asia into Mongolia. Buildings that all share certain characteristics: unusual height, geometric precision, architectural styles that don't quite match the civilizations credited with building them, and those impossible red spires reaching toward the sky. The official explanation, when there is one, dismisses it as a rare oxidation process, specific atmospheric conditions, unusual mineral content in the copper alloys, local pollution patterns from the Industrial Revolution. Except the red coloration appears on buildings in remote areas with no industrial history. It appears on structures predating significant pollution, and it appears selectively, turning some spires red while leaving adjacent copper features green, even on the same building, as if something about those specific spires, something about their composition or their function, was fundamentally different. That's when I found the mercury, not in the architecture itself initially. In the records, customs documents from the 1700s and early 1800s showing massive shipments of mercury moving through trade routes across Central Asia. Not small quantities for mirrors or scientific instruments, industrial volumes. Thousands of pounds of mercury transported to remote regions with no documented mining operations, no obvious industrial applications, no logical reason for acquiring such quantities. The shipping manifests listed destinations that match precisely with the locations of the red spires, cities that appear on old maps as part of Tartaria, and the mercury was always shipped with something else, gold, not as currency, as raw material. Refined gold, moving in quantities that would have represented fortunes, shipped alongside the mercury to locations that weren't minting coins, weren't creating jewelry, weren't engaged in any known gold-working industry. Then the shipping records stop. Around 1850, the mercury shipments cease, the gold transport ends, and within the same decade, Tartaria begins disappearing from maps, not gradually, abruptly, as if whatever required those materials no longer existed, or was no longer permitted to exist. I started examining the spires more closely. The red ones, specifically. High-resolution imaging revealed something the naked eye misses. The coloration isn't uniform. Under magnification, the red surface shows microscopic crystalline structures, geometric patterns that don't match any known copper oxidation process. The crystals form precise angles, mathematical arrangements, and they're not on the surface, they're throughout the metal, as if the copper itself has been fundamentally altered at a molecular level. I managed to obtain samples, small fragments from a restoration project in Kazan, officially classified as construction debris. 3 pieces, each no larger than a coin. I ran them through spectrographic analysis at the university lab after hours when no one would ask questions about what I was testing or why. The readings made no sense. Mercury content throughout the copper matrix, gold microparticles embedded in crystalline structures, and mercury oxide compounds in configurations that require temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Celsius and specific atmospheric pressures to form. These aren't conditions that occur naturally. These are industrial processes. Intentional chemistry. Someone in the 1700s was creating compounds our modern metallurgy textbooks say shouldn't be stable. I saved the data to an encrypted drive, made backups, sent copies to my colleague in Prague, Dr. Helena Svobodové, who'd been researching similar architectural anomalies in Bohemian government buildings. That was 3 weeks ago. Helena hasn't responded to any communication since. Her university email bounced back, her office phone goes to a generic voicemail, and when I called the department directly they told me Dr. Svobodova was no longer with the institution, and they couldn't provide forwarding information. 2 days after Helena went silent, my office was broken into. Nothing obviously stolen. My computer was still there, my camera equipment untouched, but my files had been accessed. The drawer where I kept the metal samples had been forced open. The samples were gone, and my backup drives, hidden in a locked cabinet, had vanished. Whoever broke in knew exactly what they were looking for. I still have the original spectrographic data, the encrypted copies Helena never confirmed receiving, and I had something else they didn't find because I'd already sent it to a storage facility across town. The photograph, a single image from an 1823 foundry manual I discovered in the St. Petersburg archives, filed incorrectly under municipal water systems instead of architectural records. The photograph shows workers inside what the caption identifies as a specialized metals facility for cathedral dome construction. But these aren't ordinary metal workers. They're wearing leather suits, full body covering with what appear to be early respirators, glass-lensed hoods sealed at the neck. Their hands are wrapped in thick protective layers, and they're standing around crucibles that glow with an unnatural reddish light, working with long-handled tools to avoid direct contact with whatever they're creating. This is 1823, 30 years before the germ theory of disease, decades before industrial safety equipment becomes common. Yet these workers are dressed like they're handling something toxic, something dangerous, something that requires protocols modern chemistry would recognize as appropriate for mercury compounds. The manual includes detailed instructions. Under no circumstances should the quicksilver amalgam contact bare skin. Maintain ventilation throughout the heating process. Workers must wash thoroughly with vinegar solution after handling treated metals. And most tellingly, the red preparation must achieve full incorporation before cooling, or the material loses its conducting properties. Conducting properties, they knew. Whoever wrote this manual in 1823 understood that the compound they were creating would conduct something, not just electricity in the way normal metals conduct, but something specific, something that required exact preparation to achieve the desired effect. I keep returning to the Kazan Cathedral. I've been there 4 times now. Each visit I notice something new, something wrong. The air around the main dome doesn't just feel static, it tastes like ozone and old pennies. Your hair stands up before you even touch the stone. Stand near the base of the dome during a thunderstorm and you can hear it. Not thunder. A different sound. A low-frequency hum that you feel in your chest, that makes your teeth ache, that seems to emanate from the metal itself. The first time I experienced it, I thought I was imagining things. The second time, I brought measurement equipment, consumer-grade electromagnetic field detectors, the kind paranormal investigators use. They maxed out within 10 feet at the dome's base. Not during a lightning strike, just from ambient atmospheric conditions on a cloudy afternoon. Modern electromagnetic surveys of buildings with red spires show the same anomalous readings. The structures conduct electricity in ways standard copper architecture doesn't. During thunderstorms, during periods of high atmospheric electricity, these spires generate measurable electromagnetic fields. Not from lightning strikes, from ambient atmospheric energy, as if they're designed to collect, concentrate, or possibly redistribute electrical charge from the atmosphere itself. What if the spires weren't decorative? What if they were functional? What if Tartaria, whatever it actually was, built structures that served purposes beyond simple shelter? And what if red mercury, the compound modern science insists doesn't exist, was the key material that made those functions possible? It would explain the mercury shipments. Why transport such quantities to remote locations? Because you need mercury to create the compound. It would explain the gold. Not for currency, but as a necessary component in the alchemical process that produces red mercury. It would explain the protective equipment in that 1823 photograph. The workers weren't being superstitious. They were following safety protocols based on actual chemical knowledge. And it would explain why modern science insists red mercury is a hoax. Because admitting it exists means admitting we've lost the knowledge of how to create it and what it was used for. The architectural evidence supports this. Buildings with red spires share other unusual features. Their internal structures include hollow channels running through walls and columns, vertical shafts connecting basements to roof structures, metal frameworks integrated into stone construction in ways that serve no obvious structural purpose. as if the buildings themselves were designed as systems, with the red Mercury spires serving as collection or transmission points for something we can no longer detect or measure properly. I found something else in the archives, a letter written in 1892 by Nikola Tesla to a colleague in Vienna. The letter describes Tesla's visit to the Church of the Transfiguration in St. Petersburg, not the famous wooden church in Kiji. A different church, long since demolished, that once stood in the Admiralty district. Tesla's handwriting in the letter is shaky, excited. He describes standing beneath the church's dome, which he notes has a peculiar red crown, unlike any oxidation I have previously observed. He mentions experiencing pronounced physiological effects, including sensation of pressure in the cranium and voluntary muscular response in the extremities. And then he writes something that was apparently crossed out in the original but remains partially legible under magnification. The structure draws power from the firmament itself. The principles are sound, they knew. 3 months after that letter, Tesla begins his experiments with wireless power transmission. His tower designs, his insistence on tall structures topped with metallic spheres, his theories about extracting energy from the Earth's natural electrical fields. All of it emerges after his visit to that red-crowned dome. The church was demolished in 1894. 2 years after Tesla's visit, the official reason given was structural instability, but no other churches in the district were demolished during that period, just the one Tesla had studied, just the one with the red spire. What did he see there? What did he measure or experience that convinced him atmospheric energy collection was possible? His notes reference historical precedent and rediscovered principles. Tesla never claimed to invent wireless power transmission from nothing. He claimed to be revealing something that had been hidden, something that once existed and was lost. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, dozens of buildings with red Mercury spires were destroyed, not because they were structurally unsound. The demolition orders cite vague justifications: modernization, urban renewal, public safety concerns that are never specifically documented. But the pattern is clear. Buildings with ordinary copper domes were preserved, many still standing today. Buildings with red Mercury spires were systematically demolished. I've mapped the demolitions. 43 major structures between 1870 and 1920. Across Russia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe, every single one featured prominent red spires. Every single one was torn down despite being structurally sound. And in every case where salvage records exist, the documentation ends. Materials disposed of, copper recycled. But there are no corresponding records of the metal entering the recycling stream. It's removed from the buildings, documented, and then vanishes. Where did it go? Who wanted it, and why? When demolition wasn't practical, the spires were removed and replaced. Original red Mercury domes stripped away and replaced with conventional copper that oxidizes green like it's supposed to. The Assumption Cathedral in Vladimir. The Trinity Cathedral in Pskov. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow, rebuilt in the 1990s but with modern materials. The original red dome's composition never replicated. Each modification documented as routine maintenance. But routine maintenance doesn't explain why you'd spend resources removing functional metalwork and replacing it with nearly identical structures made of different materials, unless the original materials had properties someone wanted eliminated. Modern analysis of the buildings that survive raises more questions. Ground-penetrating radar shows unusual features beneath structures with red Mercury spires. Chambers and cavities that aren't documented in the original construction plans. Metallic frameworks embedded in foundations extending 30, sometimes 40 feet below street level. Networks of metal channels connecting these basement structures to the spire mechanisms above, as if the buildings were designed to ground themselves deep in the earth while reaching high into the atmosphere, creating complete circuits through which something could flow. But documentation of these subsurface features doesn't exist in historical records. Either the original builders didn't document them, or that documentation has been systematically removed from archives. I requested access to the original construction plans for the Kazan Cathedral from the Russian State Archive. My request was denied. Materials not available for research purposes. I tried again, going through official academic channels with university sponsorship and specific research justification. Denied again. Access restricted for preservation reasons. Plans for other buildings from the same period? Available. Plans for structures built before and after the Kazan Cathedral? Accessible, just not the ones that would show how the Red Mercury dome was actually constructed. The resistance to investigating these anomalies is what disturbs me most. When electromagnetic surveys detect unusual readings, they're dismissed as instrument error. When chemical analysis shows impossible compounds, it's attributed to contamination. When historical records document mercury shipments, they're explained away as trade in scientific instruments despite the quantities involved. Every piece of evidence is individually dismissed. The pattern as a whole is never examined. And researchers who push too hard seem to disappear. Not physically necessarily, but professionally. Helena in Prague, Dr. Yuri Kozlov in Moscow, whose 2019 paper on anomalous metallurgical properties in Tsarist-era architecture was retracted 3 months after publication for methodological concerns that were never specified. Professor Ahmed Mansour in Samarkand, who lost his university position in 2021 after publishing photographs of subsurface metallic structures beneath the Shah-e-Zind necropolis. The pattern repeats. Ask the wrong questions, lose your position, publish the wrong data, lose your funding, push too hard, and suddenly your research materials go missing and your colleagues stop returning calls. I'm not paranoid, I'm observant. And what I observe is a coordinated effort to ensure certain questions don't get asked, certain evidence doesn't get examined, certain patterns don't get recognized. What conclusions would emerge if we looked at all of it together? That Tartaria wasn't just a geographical designation, but a civilization with technological knowledge we've lost. That Red Mercury was real, was functional, and served purposes in architecture we no longer understand. But the massive spires and domes weren't aesthetic choices, but components in systems designed to harness atmospheric energy. The evidence suggests exactly that. Not ancient aliens, not mystical energies. Human technology, chemistry, and engineering that existed in the 1700s and early 1800s. Technology that left physical traces we can still measure, but technology that has been systematically erased from our understanding of history. I've examined hundreds of photographs from the 1800s showing these structures before their modification or destruction. The images show cities where nearly every major building featured these distinctive red domes and spires, skylines dominated by crimson peaks catching the light, and contemporary accounts describe them with a casualness that suggests they were completely ordinary. No one in the 1820s thought these red spires were unusual. They were simply how important buildings looked. An 1834 travel diary from a French diplomat describes St. Mate, Petersburg. The city presents a peculiar aspect under stormy skies when the crimson crowns of its principal structures seem to glow within a light, as though competing with the lightning itself, blowing during storms, not reflecting light, generating it, or conducting it, or collecting it in ways that made them visible even from a distance. A British architect's journal from 1847 mentions visiting a government building in Kazan. The sensation upon entering is most peculiar. One's hair becomes quite disordered, and I observe my pocket watch behaving erratically, its hands spinning backwards momentarily. The Russian officials seemed entirely accustomed to these effects and paid them no mind. Electromagnetic interference strong enough to affect mechanical watches, effects so common the building's occupants considered them normal. What were they working with? What systems were running in those structures that generated fields powerful enough to disrupt timekeeping devices? A merchant's letter from 1856 describes conducting business in a Bukhara administrative center. The building hums with a constant low sound, felt more than heard. The local translators assure me this is normal, that the structure sings in certain weather. I found the atmosphere unsettling and preferred to conduct future negotiations in the open market. These aren't myth or folklore. These are contemporary accounts from educated observers describing physical phenomena they personally experienced, phenomena that disappeared after the buildings were demolished or modified, phenomena we no longer observe because the structures that generated them no longer exist in their original form. What happened? Why did it stop? The timeline suggests an answer. The Red Mercury construction peaks in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Then, around 1850, it ends. No new buildings with Red Mercury spires, no more mercury and gold shipments. And Tartaria vanishes from cartographic record. Was it deliberate suppression? The mid-1800s marked the beginning of the petroleum industry, the rise of coal as a dominant energy source, the emergence of centralized power generation as a foundation of industrial capitalism. Free atmospheric energy collection, if that's what these spires provided, would represent an existential threat to industries just beginning to consolidate control over energy production and distribution. If you can't control the energy source, you can't control the economy. You can't meter atmospheric electricity. You can't bill someone for what they collect from the sky. The entire structure of industrial capitalism requires scarce, controllable energy sources. Coal, oil, later nuclear and natural gas all require infrastructure, transportation, refining, distribution networks that generate profit at every step. A building that pulls energy directly from the atmosphere, that's not just an alternative technology, that's a threat to the entire economic model emerging in the mid-1800s. I don't have definitive proof of deliberate suppression, but I have the timeline. I have the systematic demolitions. I have the vanished research and the disappeared colleagues. I have the missing samples and the denied archive access. And I have 43 buildings with red Mercury spires, all destroyed within 50 years, while hundreds of buildings with ordinary copper domes from the same period still stand. The buildings, remember, even if we don't. The electromagnetic surveys detect properties we can't explain. The chemical analyses show compounds that shouldn't exist. And the historical records, before they end, before the Great Silence descends, tell us that mercury and gold moved in massive quantities to build something we've lost the ability to understand. 3 days ago, I received an anonymous email. No sender information, no subject line. Just a link to a news article from a Kazakhstani architectural journal. The article announces a restoration project for the Assumption Cathedral in Astana, one of the few remaining structures with its original red mercury dome intact. The restoration, funded by an unnamed private foundation, will include modernization of the dome structure using contemporary materials to ensure long-term preservation. Contemporary materials, not restoration. Replacement. They're going to remove the red dome, the last major example of red mercury architecture still accessible to researchers. And they're doing it now, under the guise of preservation, eliminating the final piece of evidence that could prove what these structures really were. The work begins in 6 weeks. Once that dome comes down, once it's replaced with modern copper that will oxidize green like it's supposed to, we lose the last chance to study an intact example, the last chance to understand what was lost, the last chance to prove that red mercury was real, was functional, and represented technology we've deliberately chosen to forget. I'm making this recording because I don't know how much time I have. Helena disappeared. The others lost their positions, their research, their credibility. My samples are gone. My office has been compromised. And now the last remaining evidence is about to be dismantled under the banner of architectural preservation. The red Mercury spires of Tartaria weren't decorative excess. They weren't ceremonial architecture. They were technology. Human technology that worked, that served functions we can still measure but can no longer replicate. Technology that was systematically suppressed, demolished and erased from history because it threatened to disrupt the entire foundation of industrial energy control. And they're erasing the last of it right now, in 6 weeks, in Astana. The final red crown coming down, replaced with ordinary metal, the evidence disposed of just like the 43 before it. Unless someone stops them, unless someone asks why, unless someone demands access to that structure before it's too late, the copper turns red impossibly, persistently, defiantly. And in that crimson surface, in those electromagnetic fields, in those anomalous chemical readings that cost Helena her career, and maybe worse, the evidence persists. Not waiting patiently, running out of time. 6 weeks until the last red dome falls, and with it, the final proof that we forgot something that mattered. What will they tell us after Astana? That it never existed. That the red was always just unusual oxidation. That the electromagnetic readings were instrument errors and the mercury compounds were contamination, and the protective equipment in that 1823 photograph was just decorative costumes. How much can they erase before we finally admit that the absence of evidence, when it's this systematic, this coordinated, this persistent, is evidence itself? Evidence that someone doesn't want us to remember. Evidence that what we've forgotten was important enough to suppress. Evidence that the red Mercury spires of Tartaria represented something we're still not allowed to understand. 6 weeks. The clock is running, and I'm out of colleagues to share this with.